Hello, Rita, Soni. Welcome to the Doing CX Right show.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Really excited for this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I am grateful. And you do have a fan club. There's several people I've been talking to, and they mentioned you. And I was like, wow, what a small world, because we're going to be together today. So I hope that I don't know the saying, your ears ringing, ears burning, whatever that is. It's people are talking favorably about you. So please share with my audience, first of all, who are you? What do you do professionally?
I think the reason that you're hearing me, it's probably not just me, it's more the space that I've really been privileged to work in. So my name is Rita Soni. I'm principal analyst for impact sourcing and sustainability research at Everest Group. And I am just thrilled that the ideas behind impact sourcing have taken off, and we're just doing incredible work around it. I joined Everest Group 2 years ago, but before that, more than a decade, almost a decade ago, I was heading up the NASCOM Foundation, where the term impact sourcing was born. And since then, we've just seen it grow in acceptance and in practice, not just in the developing world, which is where I think a lot of people thought it was going to be, but also globally. And so for me, that's great, because I am an Indian American kid who happened to go to India for 10 years by accident. And so to bring all of those ideas here and talk about sustainability and talk about inclusion it's just been great.
I love that. Why your passion around this topic?
That's a good question. I started life out as an engineer working for GE, eventually getting into finance like many people at GE. And I was learning, I was growing, but there did seem like there was something missing. It was like, isn't there some grander purpose? And this was before people really talked about purpose in business. So I went to grad school for international affairs and came out thinking, oh, it's all the nonprofits out there that are doing good. Let me just, find my way into a nonprofit. And it's really that journey to India that got me to realize that the challenges of our society are just so grand and so huge that it can't just be one segment that is trying to solve them. It's also when we started to see CSR really kind of taking a lot of flight. We also started to see social enterprises taking flight. So I got the opportunity to get first into banking and then later at NASCOM to be able to bring my sort of tech for good ideas to fruition. So yeah, I like to say that I'm an engineer turned do-gooder, but I think being the engineer is kind of ingrained in me and an important part of all of this.
Well, one more question before we get to the meat of all of this, and that is a fact about you, a fun fact or something people may not know.
Well, there's a goofy fact. A lot of people, when they meet me, depending on where I am, they'll ask, where are you from? And I often say that, what do you mean by that question? There's like a multitude of answers to that. But the funniest part of my answer is I was actually born in Alabama, and my father was studying to get his master's at the University of Alabama. And I only lived there for 12 days. So that's my funny fun fact.
Yes, that is unusual to move that quickly after you're born. But yay, yes. Well, all right. So let's get into the heart of the topic here, which is people might not understand what impact sourcing actually means. Can you explain?
Sure. And really, the terminology is important just so we're on the same page. But what we've also found is that there's a lot of different vocabulary around this practice. So let me more describe what the practice is. It's about inclusive hiring practices as they apply to the global services industry. So the term sort of came about more describing what it is that buyers are doing, that they're sourcing with an impact in mind. What we've found is that this is well beyond what procurement and sourcing are doing, but it's It's across the technology stacks. It's across industries. It's even internal in many cases when you look at global in-house centers. So it's the idea that this industry has the potential of being inclusive like no other. And the reason for that is because technology enables inclusion, both from a training perspective, but also an enablement. Whether it's tools for people with disabilities, if you have a visual impairment, potentially having a screen reader software, or other ways. The other way that this is an inclusive space or can be is sort of the ubiquity of it. We're finding that, as we talk about job losses and we talk about or the fears of job loss, what we're finding is that actually many more jobs have been added since we've talked about job loss. So, for example, I said that this started more than a decade ago. At that time, almost no one was doing the kind of data labeling and work we need to do to, say, create autonomous vehicles, for example. But today, that's a huge part of what's happening, particularly when it comes to impact sourcing.
So I want to dummy this down a bit more for people who may not understand what you're saying. Are you speaking specifically contact centers, customer service centers, or broader than that?
So, I want to say that it's much broader than that, but I also want to acknowledge that the CX industry has in many ways put this practice on the map.
Mm.
They've really, embraced it, scaled it, and the kinds of changes that have happened just because of that embrace is really what's fascinating. As I said earlier, it's truly become a global phenomenon. But when you look at particular geographies where it's so important, and particular communities where it can have such a big difference, I would say, the contact center space, the CX space, has really brought to fruition kind of the beauty of this talent model.
Mm. This is the Doing CX Right show. So help me understand. Well, I know my audience understand. To you, how does impact sourcing come together with customer experience? What does that mean to you?
I think one of the best examples, or one of the best ways to explain things, is through examples.
Mhm.
And one great example that I heard when I was visiting South Africa to see what's happening there from an impact sourcing perspective was related to a CX employee who worked on things like loan recovery. And she came from a low income community in South Africa. And when she talked to the end user, the end customer, about recovery and about getting out of debt, she spoke with empathy that it was just very genuine and felt by that end customer and end user. And so that, I think, that sort of is where we see the inclusion piece is not
Mm.
inclusion for everybody else, is like it's just everybody else. This person represents who we all are in a way.
Mm. What are some misperceptions, misses in maybe it's bias that is typical, and is it getting better from your perspective?
If I say the misperceptions versus vis-a-vis impact sourcing, I think we've already talked about how it's become this global phenomenon. I think there's also an assumption that it's only low end work that is happening through impact sourcing, and that's just not the case. We're finding people at every level and rising through the ranks, and in many ways, this being sort of an on ramp into certain industries or certain businesses. I think the other misconception about this is that only specific communities could be benefited from this, but that's also not happening. There's so much variety of how companies are saying exclusion happens in the places that they operate. So, for example, there's some companies that are focused on including refugee communities. There's one company that said we're gonna have as one of our key communities solo parents, and they were very I want to say deliberate about saying solo parents and not just single moms. And then there was another one that I heard about recently, which talked about in a very sad way. They talked about some of the losses in their workplace from COVID. So they decided they were going to actually target the spouses of those folks that passed away and
Mm.
and open up their business to employ them. So, I think inclusion or, breaking down those barriers in such a innovative, creative way is probably the biggest thing that I find that I find feel very passionate about. That there's sort of the art of the possibilities is truly here, as opposed to when we hear about the art of the possibility.
So we know factually that you can't have a great customer experience without people, employees, staff, agents feeling valued, empowered, trusted. So one fuels the other. How does impact sourcing affect the delivery of customer experience? What do you want leaders to know that why they should make this a priority?
I love that question. And it reminds me of when I first entered into working with people with disabilities. Um, Many of the things that we learn out of being inclusive end up being beneficial for everyone.
Mhm.
I'm sure most of your audience has heard the typical thing with you build a ramp, and that might be for a person who's permanently in a wheelchair, but then, at some point you twist your ankle and that ramp is very useful because you're on crutches.
Yeah.
So in that same way, I think the philosophies that go around inclusion, that come with inclusion in this space, apply. Just workplace activities. So this company that's talking about solo parents, for example, they've decided that they're going to double the number of sick days for those folks. Because in other households where there are two parents, there are two sets of sick days. So I think that's more of how I see the benefit, how it's benefiting the business. And then, of course, there are the examples that we talked about at the beginning, that people are excluded from jobs that are part of our normal society.
Mm.
And it's our normal society that we all, as businesses, are trying to benefit and trying to be customer service for. So they're just representative, and I think that's the most important part of when we think about inclusion as a concept, we think about impact sourcing as a concept. That to me is really critical for the industry. And
Mhm.
that's not to mention the multiplier effect of these kind of programs. We don't really think about it when we're just, we see businesses growing. But when you see a business that's being intentionally inclusive, you think about the family members of each of those individuals. You think about the communities that they came from and the follow-on effect that this is going to have. And you think about the sort of backward and forward linkages of those businesses growing. A lot of impact sourcing is happening by specialist companies. And the reason that we call them specialists is that their primary talent strategy, as opposed to being incorporated in the business, their
Mm.
primary talent strategy is being inclusive. And in those places, the backward and forward linkages are businesses that get set up because that business has just grown 2 and 3 and 5 fold, as well as the input process. So the way educational institutions change, the way even things like marriage age and the number of kids that people have. It just boggles my mind, all the possibilities. I think back to when I was in grad school and thinking about economic development in this very theoretical way. And this is exactly it. Get good jobs that are meaningful and paying you fair wages and treating you well, and see the whole effect on all those around you.
Mm. Who typically owns the decision and actually implementation of the programs? Is that HR? Is that other?
Yeah, I think that is one of the really interesting things that we've seen. I assumed, when we started wanting to promote this, I really did assume going to HR would be kind of the quickest way. But I think you do you do need leadership buy-in at the end of the day. And then secondly, really the second most important constituent are your operations leads. They're
Mm,
defining who it is that is going to be on the shop floor. And without their buy-in, you really can't bring in the best program around impact sourcing. And then, of course, I think, or maybe this is just unsaid, but your end client that you're doing this work for, they obviously need to be bought in as well. In many of these business relationships, they're defining the levels of education, the other kinds of qualifications that individuals have. So the buyer, in the end of the day, has to be part of this process, because
mm,
you're going to need to change that. In order to be inclusive, you're going to need to question some of those assumptions and push the envelope on who is it that's going to be the best person for that seat versus what's been kind of the norm of that process.
mm. I believe that having formal programs like any other program besides this, like you do need executive buy-in. You need it drilled down from the bottom and from the top and the bottom. I also think that leaders have to do the basics right without a formal program. And what I mean is, I had a bunch of agents, call center agents, and one in particular, she had a stroke. And when she came back, did everything possible to make it easy for her. So even the equipment that she used, an earpiece, had to get some special equipment. And to me, that's not like a formal program. That's just get the basics right. What's your view on that? I mean, it's both,
Right,
right?
right, right. No, I think it's a perfect example. And I think it gets back to when the iPhone decided to put that little accessibility dot.
Yeah.
And this is back when there was a button, right? How many people were using that accessibility dot because their button stopped working? And I don't think anyone used that dot thinking, oh, this is for only for people with disabilities. It was not just an accessibility dot. So absolutely, I think the universality of being intentionally inclusive,
Yeah.
it's yeah, that's a perfect example.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that we are in an industry where he could come back, right? That
Right. Right.
there are so many debilitating things about having a stroke, and it's
Hmm.
amazing that she could come have a job where she can be comfortable, sit down and do her thing and still relate to people. And yeah, that's amazing.
But I also think that while HR does tell kind of the rule of the land, we as human beings and leaders have to know intuitively, how do I make it more comfortable so that she can deliver customer excellence because we took care of her. And that's not a program. That's not an HR, paid initiative. This is just us being human. So I hope people are reminded from this that you need to do the basics right.
Yeah, I think, and Stacy, we're just coming out of this crazy pandemic. I think that human aspect, or just being genuine, I think that's embedded in us now, at least. And let's see how long.
Yeah.
I hope it lasts very long, but I think there's just that much more empathy and compassion that we all have for each other, given this difficult time we've all been through. And now
Yeah.
I think we can also see the benefits to business from that. The remote working and
Yeah.
yeah, all the different ways that we can make life a little easier.
Yeah. I think the gig economy is actually helping the growth and the nurturing of impact sourcing.
We do see impact sourcing as an intentional part of some gig companies. And then we see even combining this idea of being a specialist company and doing
Mm.
impact sourcing and doing gig work. There's a small company based out of France called Isahit, where they they target only women that have been typically excluded and are from lower income communities. And they ask them to come up with three goals. One of three goals, that they're joining this job to gain tech skills. They're joining this job to save money for an entrepreneurial enterprise, or they're saving money for higher education. So it's actually forced gig. Can't do more than 100 hours a month. I think it is. I can't remember the exact. But there's this very deliberate view that this kind of gig work can then put you on a path that you've predefined.
Mm.
And I've had the honor of meeting one of their agents who, through COVID, had challenges with childcare. I think she was a teacher, and needed to find a new way of operating. And Isahi gave it to her, and she sees herself eventually. She actually saw that this big need, that when you have working parents, having good childcare that meets your needs as in terms of when you go to work and when you come back. She decided she was going to start a daycare center eventually in Colombia that would help with that. So, I think
Mm.
I think this idea that there are all these different opportunities through gig work or through other ways of inclusion, I think it's definitely there.
I also want to bring another slant to this. When I was working at Verizon and I was on the e commerce team, we would bring people who with colorblind, people who were completely blind to do user testing to make sure that we were designing for people with different abilities. And that's another area that companies need to do more of around the voice of the customer for all segments.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And testing in a bunch of different industries has definitely been a really interesting use case for people with certain disabilities.
Mhm.
We also see people on the autism spectrum that have been very useful for particular activities that are repetitive and require a huge amount of focus. So you're absolutely right. I think enabling people based on what it is that they're good at is sort of the point. Yes.
Mm. I love how you said tech for good because I had not heard that phrase. And it makes so much sense that we need to use technology to enhance experiences, especially our employees, our staff, our agents, our gig workers, our interns, so they can literally pay it forward. And
Totally.
that makes so much sense. So I want people to think of technology in that way. It's not meant to completely replace us, but to enhance experiences if you do it right.
That's right. That's right. Reducing the barriers for entry, creating pathways for folks. It's all possible through the different enabling technologies. And
Mm.
I think reducing burden is also important, which is coming from a lot of the automation technology. So yes, tech for good is an amazing phrase. And yeah, I think every technology company thinking about how their technology then enables more is sort of the opportunity.
So let me ask you some rapid fire questions here as we're getting to the end. If I had tons of leaders, CEOs, entrepreneurs, people who can make a difference in organizations around the world, what do you want them to know? What's the one key takeaway?
the biggest thing is take your blinders off. Um, we
Mm,
are in a point right now where there's so much talk of a talent dearth. And I think businesses are over and over and over again demonstrating that there's talent that is untapped. There are companies in the United States that are working inside women's prisons. There are companies in India that are working in rural communities. There are folks in across Europe that are tapping the unfortunate circumstances of refugee communities. So I think it's just take those blinders off and recognize when we look at talent, there's just so many groups that are being left out. And this
mm.
is the time that we should be including them.
Take your blinders off. Yes. And use tech for good, for goodness. Yes. So, can you tell me what is the best leadership advice you've been given or that you've given to others?
Yeah, I think it's actually kind of the same. I received this advice and have since been able to use it in my leadership roles. And it's around continuous growth and
Mm,
learning and pushing your own envelope. I actually said to my colleagues when I was in India that if your resume is not growing, it's not changing and evolving from your time here, it's time to move on. Uh, it's time to find that next challenge. And I think what's exciting about today's day and age is there are all these humongous global challenges of inequity, of within sustainability, all of these different challenges, and we know that technology exists to help us overcome those challenges. People are passionate about these things. We now see purpose as embedded,
mm,
especially
yes.
among very young employees wanting to find passion. So really there's endless possibilities of continuing to grow and solve these problems. So yeah, I think it's about growth and change and learning.
Mm. And if you could go back in time to your younger 20-year-old self based on what you know now that you didn't know then, what would you tell younger Rita?
Oh, that's a good one. I don't know. Honestly, Stacy, I don't know if this is really cliche to say, but I really like the crooked path that I've had. So I don't know that I would suggest a more straight path to where I'm at, but maybe more just like enjoy the journey. The crooked is fine, and changing course is fine. It's just it's just that much more excitement in life.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it would be that.
I love that. It's not always a straight line and to embrace the crooked.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. And I will have links to your social media and places to find you. And you're doing such impactful work, and it is felt around the world. It's noticed. And so thank you.
Thanks so much, Stacy.